I want to bring attention to the unique ways in which National Aboriginal Day dispels tainted worldviews about the way of life of Indigenous people.
National Aboriginal Day, also referred to as NAD, is not only a cultural event, it's an event suited to advance the Indigenous agenda. It also promotes a sense of agency and critical understanding of the social context through the use of Indigenous epistemology and values. Did you know that NAD is celebrated every year on June 21st? And do you know why? This day of recognition came about after a series of calls for such a celebration by the National Indian Brotherhood, now the Assembly of First Nations, that called for the creation of a National Aboriginal Solidarity Day to be celebrated on June 21st. For too long, the education about Indigenous people has been marginalized to promote Western ideologies. It is well documented that the control of Indigenous education did not rest with the people. Consequently, Indigenous knowledge was not captured and stored in a systemic way by Eurocentric education systems. It is argued that First Nation epistemology is different from Western paradigm, and it is critical that an epistemic shift is required to address the concerns of Indigenous people. In these times, Indigenous education can no longer be Eurocentric. This is embedded in the theoretical framework of Indigenous scholars who argue that Eurocentric education cannot rectify the consequences of colonialism on its own. Indeed, Aboriginal education needs to be reframed in an Aboriginal context that will provide Aboriginal children with a sense of self-worth. That is, a sense of who they are, where they come from, which will impact community self-government and self-determination. More than ever, Indigenous people are positioning themselves as a strong, principled, and determined people. To achieve these goals, Indigenous people have come together in solidarity to strengthen Indigenous education sovereignty. One way this sovereignty is established is through NAD, which demonstrates that Indigenous knowledge is a valuable knowledge system. NAD is not just about eating bannock, learning to make dream catchers, and dancing at powwows. It's a system whereby the power of education is distributed to Indigenous people as an opportunity to decolonize Western ideologies. While NAD doesn't set out to remove the colonization experience, it has an underlying philosophy that promotes Indigenous values and depicts Indigenous people as having a long and proud history that includes rich cultural and spiritual traditions. Fortunately, traditional Indigenous cultures have provided cultural maps based upon language, stories, science and technology, and role models to maintain the connections between these realms and to pursue actions that support the survival of the people and their beliefs. It's time to look at other methodologies and contest an imposed Western framework. A framework of Indigenous knowledge systems can be found in events like NAD. NAD can equip people with the resources critical to understanding Indigenous knowledge systems, practices, and traditions. This revisioning of critical pedagogy provides for a true way of understanding the Indigenous population. As a project, NAD provides an inclusive situation for critical methodologies and Indigenous discourses. These Indigenous projects embody a pedagogy of hope and freedom. They turn the pedagogies of oppression and colonization into pedagogies of liberation. They are not purely utopia, for they map concrete performances that can lead to positive social transformations. NAD encourages processes that mobilize and transform communities at the local level. It honors Indigenous cultural practices and in doing so contributes to the steps that healed the wounds of colonization. So how does NAD reinstate Indigenous worldviews while decolonizing Western ideologies? Well, over the years, NAD has brought Indigenous worldviews to the forefront in Canada and has been successful in alleviating the misunderstanding of previous discourse while restoring Indigenous identity in a positive light. NAD has sound disciplines that assure access to Indigenous languages, values, knowledges, and worldviews. Events like this also help raise awareness about the contributions of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. This event provides for optimal learning environments and promotes a sense of understanding through the use of Indigenous epistemology and values. It's an opportunity to talk about the real actions communities can take to make a difference. It's a great open forum to discuss issues relating to the education improvement of Indigenous people. NAD is an exemplary way to demonstrate best practices of Indigenous pedagogies while providing extraordinary experiences for students, which can help them overcome the tremendous challenges they face in this colonial world. NAD is a day when people have the opportunity to engage more deeply with Indigenous learning processes. It has the potential to develop meaningful connections between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. It can bridge differences and can create community and is a foundation for holistic learning, relationship building, and practical learning. As a method to critically inform, NAD can give shape to new knowledge production while joining Indigenous and Western knowledge systems to ensure an accurate account of the Indigenous way of life. Finally, conducted in an inclusive setting, National Aboriginal Day is an authentic situation that can guide Indigenous practices rooted in Indigenous education sovereignty.